Hi everyone, in this video I'm looking at the basics of gender in Roman society. This is an introduction for the NCEA scholarship topic of gender and society at Rome. So first things first, some terms and definitions which are important for this topic. Firstly, I'm going to look at these from a modern perspective. I've taken these definitions from the World Health Organization if you want to have a look at them in greater detail. So firstly, we need to look at what is meant by sex, which refers to the biological and physiological characteristics of females, males, and intersex persons. So these are things like chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. Whereas gender refers to socially constructed characteristics. So these are norms, behaviours and roles associated with being a woman or being a man, or whether someone has a different gender than that. And so it's important to be aware that sex is biological, it's scientific, whereas gender is made by society, and because it's made by society, it will be different in different societies. So different cultures have different concepts of what the different genders are, and what they look like, and they also change over time, as we will see when we're looking at Roman ideas about gender. So sex and gender are different things, scientific versus social, but they do interact with one another. They do have a relationship with one another, as we'll see. So if we move on now to look at gender in ancient Rome, so with the Romans, as in most societies even today, they linked gender to the sex of the newborn baby. So they looked at its genitals and then they decided whether it was a boy or a girl. And it's interesting, we find out from the Roman doctor Serranus that this is actually the very first thing that happens when a child is born. So as soon as a baby is born, the midwife will announce to the parents, mainly the father, the sex of the child, and this is before she will even make any remarks about the condition of the child, whether it's physically normal, that sort of thing. So it's seen as, I guess, an extremely defining characteristic. In Roman eyes, gender was a dichotomy. There's two different options, male or female only. So they had very strong ideas about gender, and these would be put upon a child at birth. Right from the beginning, it would be treated differently depending on whether it was a boy or a girl. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in further weeks. Now I'd like to have a look at a couple of key cultures which had an influence on ideas and values around gender in ancient Rome. So the first is the Etruscans. This was an earlier Italian culture and a neighbour of early Rome. So this was an older culture who pre-existed the Romans. So in Etruscan society, male and females would live together quite closely in households. Couples would dine together, and women could move about freely in public, going to the market, going to visit friends' places, and so on. And this is in contrast to, for example, if you studied Athenian social life in level 1 classical studies, you'll remember that in ancient Athens, women actually lived in a separate part of the house. They did not go to men's dinner parties, well, not respectable freeborn women, and they pretty much couldn't go out. They might occasionally go to friends' places or specific festivals, but ideally a freeborn woman should stay at home. So while, as we'll see, the Romans took some ideas from the Greeks, they also took these ideas from the Etruscans, and so there was a little bit more equality than in Greek eyes. However, the Romans did continue on some beliefs that the Greeks had, an important one being that women were inferior to men. And Aristotle, a Athenian philosopher, explains this, that the male is by nature superior and the female is inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. So it's just taken for granted that men are superior to women and therefore should be in charge of them. We have a saying that children should be seen and not heard, but ideally in Greek society, women shouldn't be seen, heard, or even mentioned. And so there's a very famous quote from Thucydides, another Athenian, who said that the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men. So ideally as a woman, your goal should be to not give men anything to say about you. So now if we have a look at what this meant in Rome, we can say that the Roman women had more sexual equality compared to other Mediterranean cultures, like the Greeks. Not compared to today in a lot of cultures, but they did have some freedom which other women at the time did not have. However, they were still seen as inferior to men, as we'll have a look at in a moment. Male children were generally preferred to females, partially because of these I guess morals, these ideas that men were superior. Also because a man would be able to inherit his father's property, carry on his father's property line, whereas daughters would go off to someone else's family, and they would also need to be provided with a dowry, so you pretty much had to pay to get rid of them. One consequence of this preference is that female children could be exposed at birth, basically rejected by the family, left to die, and this eventually did lead to an imbalance in the ratio between the sexes. So Cassius Dio reports that there was actually a time when there were more men than women at Rome, and this was certainly a problem that Augustus was dealing with during his morality reforms as well. I now want to talk about some, I guess, basic stereotypes about masculinity and femininity in Roman society. So, in Roman eyes, the man was the ideal human. He was seen as rational, competent, self-restrained. So as well as being physically stronger, men were also stronger than women intellectually. And so because of this, they were better suited to run the household and in particular its members. They were born to be in charge, basically. In contrast with that, women were seen to be physically weak but also morally inadequate, and intellectually underdeveloped. So they were emotional, irrational, incompetent. They lacked self-control. As a result of this, they were prone to vice. They were thought to be obsessed with alcohol and sex. They lacked moderation. They lacked control. And so they needed to be supervised by men. It's quite interesting as well as these, I guess, more social or emotional views. There's also a scientific view as summarized by the Roman Dr. Galen in the 2nd century AD. And he says, just as the human species is the most perfect of all the animals, within the human the man is more perfect than the woman. And the reason for his perfection is his greater heat, for heat is the first instrument of nature. And basically, his reasoning for this is that women's genitals are similar to men's genitals. They've developed from them, but men's genitalia is external because their bodies are warm enough that their genitals can function on the outside, whereas women don't have enough body heat, and so that means that their genitals have to go inside them. And so, therefore, men are better than women. So you can take from that what you will. And he then goes on to explain, you should not think that our Creator would purposely make half the race imperfect and as it were mutilated, unless there was to be some great advantage in such a mutilation. So he is on the one hand saying that women are imperfect and mutilated. They are physically, biologically inferior to men, but it's not the gods making a mistake. They have made these imperfect humans on purpose so that they can reproduce. So there you go. And just to change the subject slightly and finish off, just a couple of words about our sources, and this is something you need to keep in mind for this entire topic. So there are some huge limitations for us when we are looking at gender in ancient Rome. The main thing is that pretty much all our written sources come from aristocratic men, so not just men, but men from the upper classes. We have very little from women, so we don't really know what it means to be a woman from a woman. And so when you're reading historical texts, when you're looking at artworks and artifacts, make sure that you keep in mind whose perspective this is coming from, and therefore how that might shape what is being said. So we do need to take a lot of this with a grain of salt. So that's our introduction to ideas about gender in ancient Rome, and we'll expand on it in tutorials.